you all for joining us, speakers and viewers alike, in this event that ESCWA and the Palestinian Policy Network Shabaka are jointly organizing as part of the observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. From ESCWA's point of view, this event comes after the official ceremony we had this morning, and both are meant to highlight ESCWA's support to the Palestinian people, and that the support remains unhinged and unchanged amidst the major changes affecting the region and the world as a whole. In fact, these changes are one of the main reasons that dictate or deemed this webinar or this thinking process necessary in order to assess the question of international aid. And we have political developments, political frameworks changing and shifting. We have economic models changing and some of them collapsing. Changes in international relations everywhere, and economic crises also. The ability of countries to pitch in money will change, we're assuming. So back, we go down to the issue of Palestine, international aid, and donor funding. This aid, which has been based on several pillars, are seeing some of these pillars shifting and changing as well. The first, which is the clearest, is that the international aid has been based on the framework of the two-state solution to prepare for the emergence of a independent Palestinian state. This, based on the agreements of the Paris Protocol, with that all assumed it will be 5 years or maybe a few more than that before a Palestinian independent state would emerge. This was, of course, about 28 years ago. This, I don't know, this poses a few questions. Another one of the changes is the shift that we've been seeing for a long time now, from development to humanitarian aid. The focus of the humanitarian appeals for the UN, for example, is towards humanitarian aid. And that's not very surprising, given that the socioeconomic conditions in the Palestinian occupied Palestinian territory has been deteriorating, plunging more and more people into poverty, into need, and having basically at least half of the population needing some kind of assistance, which the international community is supposed to be providing through the humanitarian aid mechanisms, including the United Nations system. Of course, this changes. This is different between sector and sector. Changes are also between each region and another. So some of the questions we will be trying to answer today, basically, what has been the overview, or what has aid been effective? Has it all been beneficial? How do we assess that? And after, let's say, 26 years of international aid to Palestine, to the occupied Palestinian territory, in the framework that we have now. And most important of all, I think, is what do we do next? How to move forward? Where to start? With us today are four friends and very prominent researchers, practitioners who have, well, all of them are very well published, very well versed, and We're going to start with Ala Tartir, Dr. Ala Tartir, who is the Policy and Program Advisor at Shabaka, and our partner in this event, and he is a researcher at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. Ala has been working on the issue of aid for quite some time, and we'll start with him by giving us a very brief overview on aid to the occupied Palestinian territory and the dependency on the Palestinian dependency that came out of that, as well as some of the approaches of understanding all that, the angles and the views. I have to say before we start that viewers viewers can pose questions on the Facebook page, on the live Facebook page we're broadcasting this webinar on, and each speaker will hopefully speak for 8 to 10 minutes maximum to allow time for discussion afterwards. So, Ala, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rabia, and thank you, ESCWA, for joining forces to organize this panel and event today. And on behalf of Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, I would like to welcome you all and thank you all for joining the panel today. We're hoping to provide some food for thought, but some direction on this question of aid. So thank you all, speakers and audience. In my brief intervention, I would like to cover the issues that Rabia talked about, quick overview about aid, what's been the impact of this aid so far, how we can understand this aid to assess its effectiveness or not, and finally conclude with some thoughts on how we can reinvent the aid framework that's been going on for 30 years. But first, let me start with an early warning message. And today, in observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, we are not discussing an uplifting issue. In fact, we're rather discussing a very unpleasant topic. However, on the other hand, we can reverse many of the issues that we will be discussing, and first and foremost by listening to the Palestinian people and their aspirations. So if there is one message on this day, it's really that now we need to listen to the Palestinians and the Palestinian people in particular and their aspiration more than any time before. And for the question of aid, that will be one prerequisite to ensure that Palestinians are in path to ensure self-determination in the aid intervention and aid framework. So when this aid framework was created or was invented almost 3 decades ago, it aimed to achieve 3 main objectives. It aimed to achieve a lasting peace. It aimed to achieve and build effective, accountable, and democratic Palestinian institutions as part of the state-building project. And finally, it aimed to induce sustainable socio-economic development. 30 years after, we're here today not celebrating any of these. In fact, we're further away from any of these 3 objectives that the international community set for the international aid intervention and paradigm. The state is further away than any time before. Instead of celebrating development, we're seeing de-development at so many levels. We're seeing entrenched status of dependency, and none of these 3 objectives have been achieved. But to give you like an idea about the magnitude of this enterprise or this aid industry, over the past, since 1993 and since Oslo was signed, so Oslo Agreement was signed, we're talking about 40 billion or over 40 billion of aid delivered to the Palestinians. And that's a big amount, making the Palestinians one of the top recipients of non-military aid in the world. In other words, if we look at the past 10 years, for example, on average, Palestinians receive 2.2 billion a year. That constitutes around 20% of their GDP and around $520 per capita. That's lots of money. And that money being delivered mainly by the European Union and European countries, followed by the US and others when the US used to deliver. And the main recipient of that aid is the Palestinian Authority. That aid helped in filling lots of gaps created due to the continuation of the occupation. It helped to sustain the Palestinian Authority and also relief and, but it hardly provided any real development aid where Palestinians engage in processes to create a viable Palestinian economy. But what is important also to keep in mind that according to different studies from the UN to other research that's been conducted, between 40% to 70% of this aid landed directly and indirectly in the Israeli economy. And then there is the question that we need to ask, what do we do with this aid when that big amount lands in the Israeli economy and bringing the effectiveness or lack of it to the perspective? But to give you the bigger picture, if we're talking about 40 billion delivered over the past 30 years, if you look at recent United Nations report, they estimated that the total costs and damages and economic costs, that measurable one, that the Palestinian economy suffered from due to the continuation of occupation between year 2000 and year 2017, we're talking about 40 billion of aid, of damages, and that's only the transactional one, the economic one that we're able to measure. So if you put 48 of damages only over the past 17 years, plus 40 billions of aid over the past 30 years, then it's easy to figure out the equation. If we zoom in on Gaza, we're talking about 17 billion of losses between 2000 and 2017, which makes 6 times of the GDP of Gaza. So that's to give the big picture. But if we look at the impact of this aid, then we have one or two paradoxes that we need to deal with. The first paradox is the aid development paradox, where we see the aid amounts are increasing over time, but development indexes and development indicators, socioeconomic ones, are going the other way around. So there is like this paradox that we need to problematize. The other paradox that we have is the micro-macro paradox. We hear all these donors celebrating their successes and the change that they did to the Palestinian lives. And at the micro level, we see lots of celebration there. But this celebration does not trickle up and have like an effect at the macro level. And that's another question that we need to ask. How do we address this paradox between the micro and the macro level? So in summary, aid filled gaps, aid sustained, aid prevented further crisis, but also it sustained the status quo. And that's not good news when we talk about a status quo, because it's detrimental, it's harmful for the Palestinians and their quest for freedom and dignity. And this is where we need to deal with how do we deal with aid when it sustains the status quo and this status of dependency, and when aid is an actor and a major actor in denying Palestinian democracy and inducing harm in violation of the main principles of aid effectiveness. And there is by now an infamous equation, if we may so, to summarize the aid industry and the aid intervention. And that equation says that in the aid framework that exists in Palestine over the past 3 decades, the US decides, the World Bank leads, the European Union pays, the UN feeds, and Israel destroys. Yes, Palestinians are not mentioned there, and you did not misheard that, and I come to that in my conclusion in a minute. So that equation summarizes this issue of aid, and only when we tackle that equation, we can start questioning, we can start thinking about how to reinvent aid. Maybe in the Q&A, we can discuss the different ways that we can look at aid. There are, of course, different views about aid. Some sees it as a success, others see it as a miserable failure. And that depends on where we are at the political spectrum, but also what do we want this aid to deliver? Do we want it to deliver real peace, real development, or just use it as a tool for stability? Or do we want to use it as other tool of dominance, like the US aid in particular? And we call these approaches between instrumentalist approaches to critical instrumentalist one, to critical one, to neocolonialist one. And I'm mentioning them now and briefly here just to say that if we want to look at aid, we can fit them at least in one of these approaches and understand the effect and impact of that aid. But in the minute that I have, I would like to conclude with some main takeaways and some main conclusions here on how we can change this problematic and ineffective framework. One way to change that is to stop being fixated to the old paradigms and the old frameworks. I think 30 years of failure is quite a long time, and that is enough. And staying fixated to these frameworks will only bring the same results. It will not change the outcome. And secondly, we talked about that equation early on. So it's important that the Palestinians are not only mentioned there, but it's important that the Palestinians lead the development processes and they dictate the agenda and the conditionalities. Again, 30 years of dependency is quite long and quite enough. And it is really important, and this is my third point in the conclusion here, is to understand development way beyond that it is only a technocratic, apolitical, and neutral process. Development is a very much political process in its core. And under settler colonial project and structures of apartheid, development only means confrontation. And if we avoid that, then we're avoiding a real development. So it's important to recognize the structures of powers and relation of colonial dominance in the aid industry. Donors been delivering aid and shaping the aid framework for decades now with very, very little accountability. And now it is time to hold them accountable for the harm they caused and in order to avoid any further harm. Of course, this is easier to say than do, but what we need urgently are effective accountability mechanisms that ensure that donors and international intervention will not cause as much harm as they're doing now. And finally, as any kind of process, development is a long-term process. And as any process, it requires a leadership. And that leadership is missing. And here I'm talking about Palestinian-led leadership. In order to lead that process to deliver different outcomes, a different framework, different strategic thinking and direction is needed. After all, if Palestinians themselves don't ensure dignity in their own development, no one will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions. I'll leave it to last about especially being easier said than done. I'll leave them to the discussion afterwards. Thank you, Ala. Mandy Turner, Professor Mandy Turner at the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. She was previously the director of the Kenyan Institute in East Jerusalem for quite a few years, well, 5 years. And she has also lots of publications about the politics of aid, especially in Palestine, and the issue, and has a number of papers and articles about the condition of the Israeli occupation. She'll be talking a bit about, in general, about the conditionality of aid, the development models in which it's promoted through, and possibly the possible future of aid in the uncertain political setting that we are going through. And she will be, I think, taking off where Ala stopped. So please, Mandy, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabia. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very clear.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank ESCWA and Shabaka for the invitation to speak at this event marking the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. I think the topic that you've decided upon is a very important one, and one that all of us here have been researching for many, many years. Just to set you straight though, I was working and living in East Jerusalem for 8 years and just returned to the UK at the end of last year. So I had very privileged access to people working in the multiple development and humanitarian organisations, and from the various UN agencies right through to the diplomatic missions. I was able to consult them regularly on what they thought, and was actually able to hear what they thought in social circumstances too. I felt it was a very privileged position that I was in, and allowed me to form the kind of position that I'm going to outline very briefly here today. So I'm going to try and follow on from some of the comments that Ala made, and I want to try and confine my intervention, my 10-minute intervention, to make 3 main points. The first point is that aid to the OPT is not the same as aid to other country contexts. The same guiding principles that aid agencies use elsewhere do not apply to aid to the OPT, and I'll elaborate on each of these issues in a minute. The second point I want to make is that there's a huge disconnect between what the aid offices in Ramallah and East Jerusalem think and what the foreign and development agencies of their home countries think. And it's really difficult for the aid offices in Ramallah and East Jerusalem to influence the agenda back in their home countries, because this aid agenda is guided by foreign policy. And the third main point I want to make is that conditionalities on aid are being used to mobilise against any type of political movement against the occupation. And Israel is very active on pushing the donors on this. I want to focus on that towards the end of my talk. So if we take the 3 main points that I want to elaborate on, the first one on aid to the OPT. Now, what I meant by aid not being guided by the same principles as in other contexts, well, what principles are we really talking about? Well, all of us as involved in development aid research and practitioners, we usually talk about the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, the Do No Harm principle, the principles behind the Sustainable Development Goals, and all of these ideas about promoting economic development, good governance, aid transparency, and accountability. Now, in the context of the OPT, these are really only a fiction that appear in the glossy brochures of the agencies. If you speak to the officials in these agencies, they'll tell you that the best they can hope to do is to support some kind of economic activity, some level of private sector development, some form of governance framework, and some form of civil society activities. And that's about the bare minimum that they can achieve. Now, why is this? Most of us are aware now that aid to the OPT, and Ala outlined this very well, is that it hasn't helped to achieve the goal of the Oslo peace process. It's been a sticking plaster. The aid has been a sticking plaster. It's operated as a stabilisation mechanism because basically none of the major donors have changed their foreign policies towards Israel. Now, this means that in a context of settler colonialism, where land confiscation, control mechanisms and military repression are being used by the dominant force, then aid can only ever stabilise, not build. And this is a context that's deteriorating, particularly for certain parts of the OPT, such as Gaza, which Omar will speak about after me. Now, Palestinian institutions are caught in a catch-22 situation. If they don't accept aid, then there'll be problems, there'll be issues to do with salaries, the projects that they do carry out. But aid dependency also means that donors have a huge amount of control. Now, obviously, I'm using donors in the singular here, but not all donors and actors are the same. Some have less malign intent than others, but those other ones tend to have less power to influence and change the situation. We see that the United States continually followed its own agenda. The EU is divided often and has not stood up to the United States. Russia doesn't care enough, and the UN is powerless to change the political context. This means that Palestinian aid and the very future of Palestine itself is subject to the whim of who is in the White House. And we've witnessed this over the last 5 years of the Trump administration. Now, Biden will obviously no doubt restart aid and try to resurrect the two-state zombie peace. But some of the legacies of the Trump plan will endure. And Palestinian institutions will have to be very careful of thinking that the clock has been reset back to the pre-Trump days, because it will not be. So this brings me on to the second point that I want to make. There's a huge disconnect between what the field offices in Ramallah and East Jerusalem think, and the development and aid officials that work there think, and what the foreign and development agencies of their own countries think. And this was something that was constantly brought up to me by those who worked in East Jerusalem. The foreign policies of their countries dominated what was possible. Everyone in those agencies knows the developmental and governance context of the OPT. Many of them speak about this fundamental disconnect when they're telling their ministries and foreign and development ministers back home and what they felt the aid agenda actually should be doing. So most of the official language that we see in the donor reports and in the news reports is really diplomatic fluff. It's continually repeating the mantra of supporting the two-state solution, but in a context where the possibility of a Palestinian state is continually being eroded, and there's very little pressure being put on Israel to end the occupation. Back to the days of Salam Fayyad's state building project, for example, many of the donors, including the World Bank and the IMF, said back then that the Palestinian Authority was ready for statehood. But the occupation did not end, and Palestinians did not gain sovereign statehood. Now, the people who work in the missions know this, but their hands are tied. Many of them told me off the record that they were doing what they could, but knew that without a political solution, development aid was not going to build statehood or economic development. It could only continue to do more of what it has always done, which is to keep the situation from deteriorating and from spiralling out of control. Now, there are some recent differences to the aid agenda. There has been an increase in conditionalities on aid. And while some of these are related to the United States global war on terror, which the UN has sadly taken up as well, and financial de-risking, they're being applied in other countries. There's other aspects that are very, very specific to Palestine, and I want to say some words on this now. So the main thing to note about these conditionalities on aid is that they're designed to restrict Palestinian politics. Palestinian NGOs, particularly through the Pingo network, excuse me, have long complained about the anti-terror certificate which NGOs have to sign in order to access EU and US aid. Now, this certification regime has been in existence since the mid-2000s, and it defines all political organisations in the OPT, apart from the ruling Fatah party, to be terrorist organisations. And these regulations are not just about stopping money to these organisations, but they're actually also about making sure that any NGO, any aid recipient, cannot have a staff member who has connections. This is a form of policing. And that is why Pingu and other Palestinian NGOs have constantly criticised this certification regime. Now, in the past few years, in addition to this, we've also seen donors targeting the Palestinian Martyrs Fund, which provides support to the families of Palestinians killed, injured or imprisoned by Israel. Australia, for example, ended aid to the Palestinian Authority over this issue, and the United States passed the Taylor Force Act, which ended its aid. Now, it is likely that Joe Biden's administration will brings back some form of aid, but it will continue to push this as a stipulation of American aid to Palestine. But the Martyrs Fund is hugely popular amongst Palestinians and is seen as a red line. Now, this conflict, this issue around the Martyrs Fund, I think will continue to force the PLO and the Palestinian Authority will be continued to be forced by the donors to try and end this fund. Now, in addition to these two aspects, political conditionalities, we've seen a more recent conditionality being added, which relates to the Palestinian boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. Now, before I left Jerusalem last year, some donors were telling me that there's huge pressure on them to make sure that aid recipients are not supporters of BDS. The Israeli state is very active in pressurising Western governments on this. I experienced it myself in the organisation I ran in East Jerusalem. And this pressure also intersects on the pressure on Western governments and institutions to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Committee's definition of anti-Semitism, which includes criticism of Israel in its definition. So these issues are all intersecting in an attempt to close down Palestinian political options and to criminalise criticism of occupation. So I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that I don't see a change in donor aid to Palestine, at least not in the near future. I see Biden's presidency as resurrecting the zombie two-state solution mantra, but now with the added legacy of Trump. And in this context of wider political restrictions on aid disbursement related to the Martyrs Fund and the BDS movement. The hands of donor recipients in Palestine will continue to remain tied. The only power, therefore, is to not accept tied aid, which the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian NGOs have done on occasion. The only choice is to only work with donors who do not put these stipulations on aid. But this is a very, very difficult choice to make because people's livelihoods are involved here, wages and people's families are involved. So this is a very difficult choice for Palestinian NGOs to make. For people on the outside, we need to continue strong advocacy measures and to bear witness to what's going on in the OPT. We need to highlight what is wrong with the donor strategies. We need to draw attention to the context and to the diminishing developmental context, and to oppose the attempts to politically silence Palestinian opposition to the occupation and to the colonisation of their lands. And on that note, on the Day of Solidarity with the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, I'll end my comment and pass over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Although you should have maybe given us the disclaimer or the early warning that Ala, the first, for presenting a very bleak picture. Thank you. We're going to be talking about maybe what can be done to change this situation that you just described. But first, let's go to Dr. Omar Shaban, who's the political analyst, economy analyst, and the founder and director of PALTHINK, a Palestinian think tank in Gaza. Dr. Omar joining us from Gaza now. He will be talking about basically the models of aid to Gaza and their impact, especially in terms of the GRM, the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, in light of the 13-year blockade and the recurrent Israeli military operations and the destruction that has destroyed Gaza's infrastructure and economy. Dr. Omar, ahla wa sahla feek. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Rabia. Very good afternoon to all of you. I'm very pleased to be with such group friends, Mandy, Ala, and Tahani. I was thought I will be the last, but now I'm in the third, which is give me the pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to talk to you. I'll make myself precise and concise. Situation in Gaza is extremely difficult. It's good that this seminar brings Gaza again to re-highlight the crisis in Gaza. It seems that the international community has forgotten Gaza, has reached the conclusion that can Gaza live with the blockade? In reality, it's not. Things getting worse every day, especially with the corona. Now we have the blockade, the multi-layer blockade, the blockade of the Israeli, the blockade of other regional countries, the blockade of corona, all come together, make Gaza situation extremely complicated. Today we have reached to 20,000 cases. The health sector is about to collapse. The capacity of ICU is already occupied. 120 people are in the ICU. In Gaza, there is another only 120 to 130 ICU rooms in the whole Gaza Strip. There is a possibility to impose 2 weeks lockdown in couple to this weekend, just in a trial to prevent or to decrease the number of cases. I want to start by saying that, as Ala said, the international support, if it's not all, most of it is very politicized when it comes to Palestine. International support to the world, some of them are not politicized, but when it comes to Palestine, it's very politicized. In the past 14 years, we are suffering for this, the link between funding and politics. The international community has imposed a no-contact policy. Many of the international community have stopped their support to Gaza, and they changed the support to Gaza to humanitarian. And this is very important point for our audience is there is no developmental money given to Gaza. There is no support between two governments. The international community don't recognize sorry for that, but the internet is not good, but I will try to continue. The international community don't recognize the de facto authority. People are in between this situation. Last week, the UNCTAD UN agency has issued a report estimated the damages of the Gazan for the past 14 years to be 17 billion US dollar. The donation to Gaza is much less than that. So we lost $17 billion of a small economy, doesn't exceed $1 billion the GDP of Gaza, 2 million people in a very tiny place, 362 kilometers square. Second, most of this money was not directed to build the new things. It was directed to rebuild what was destroyed. And Ala and Mandy and Tahani, I'm sure, and myself, we have written about this. We were building what was destroyed, and we rebuilding again. So we found ourselves in a circle of building and rebuilding construction. So very little money was given to the education, very little money was given to the youth empowerment, was given to the factories to operate factories. Most of this money was given to rebuild what was built, what was destroyed. The reconstruction of Gaza, we have major three wars, in addition to some 200 escalation, 1 day escalation, 1 day war, 2 hours war, all type of escalation. 3 weeks escalation to 51 days escalation 2014 to 1 day war. We have experienced all these kind of things. We're not happy for that, but this is the reality. Most of the money went to rebuild what was destroyed. So the international money was used to build something that was already built more than one time. Till now, 10,000 or 11,000 housing unit was built, reconstructed from what was destroyed in 2014. Still, more than 1,200 houses were not built. A second thing, most of the private sector premises were not built. And this is very dangerous. It was very risky because many of the private sector who lost their factories have left the country have left the country, or they move to another sector because they have been waiting for a couple of years to be able to rebuild their factories. They fed up, they feel bored of that, of the international support, because the international support give the priority to the housing. So the private sector, and we talk about a couple of thousand of small businesses, infrastructure that were destroyed in the past 3 wars, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014. So the private sector, either they left the country, or either they moved to be a taxi driver, or to join the to be public servant, or even to join the military group, because they have to find a job. The situation in Gaza, I want to tackle 4 issues here, or 4 pillars. In my first is the reconstruction of Gaza, which is about to finish. There is no more money. The only thing is the Qatari payment. The Qatari payment started 20 months ago. The Qatari made 20 to 24, but it was almost a monthly payment of $20 million by the Qatari government, mediation with the Israelis, to come to Gaza for a certain things. $20 million for 2 million people, for poor people, is nothing, is very little. Tomorrow or in 2 days, the poor 100,000 poor families will go to the post office waiting for a couple of hours to receive $100. $100 for a family that number of 6 people. The poverty in Gaza has reached under the corona to 80%. 80% of the Gaza people are poor. They cannot get income. More importantly, that many of the people in Gaza who are working, they receive salary that is not enough to meet the poverty line. The poverty line in Palestine is 2,300 shekel for a family of 6 people. Majority of the Hamas employee, BA employee, receive less than that. So we have a new category, and we need to think about this to be new terminology. We have people who are working, but they are poor. So because the salary is not enough, and this is a new category because some international community consider them as employed. In fact, they are working, yes, but they receive $100, $200. The average salary in Gaza now, you can find somebody who work for 10 hours for 20 shekel, $4. So the GDP per capita for individual in Gaza is much less than $1 a day. Third thing is the PA measures. There are around 50,000 people who are used to work with the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. Some of them, they continue to receive their salaries. I'm tackling this for issue to let you know how the international community or Palestinian Authority deal with Gaza. There is no agreement between the EU and Hamas. All the money that is given indirectly to some infrastructure need, like water, electricity. So going back to the PA in March of 2017, they started some measurement. We call them punishment measures. PA doesn't like this terminology. Anyway, they call them measures. By these measures, they decrease the salaries of the PA employee in Gaza by 50%. So an employee used to receive 4,000 shekel a month. They receive 2,000 shekel a month. Some of these employees, they become poor. They fall into the category of poor people because they receive 1,200 shekel a month. Can you imagine a doctor, a professional who was educated in Europe for 10 years, go to the hospital now under the corona, helping their people, and he or she receive 1,000 shekel a month. Many of these doctors and the health workers have lost their life while they are working to the hospital. The PA introduced what they call it financial retirement, which is a new terminology. We are very unique in that. In reality, you go to your work, in paper you are retired. So you receive retirement allowances, not full salary. I have written a lot about it, and this is a scandal, is not legal at all. So the PA payment to Gaza employee was considered one of the main cash flow to the Gaza. So around $70 million a month or $80 million, say $80 million. So it was one of the driver of the Gaza economy. Third, UNRWA. UNRWA is a major player in Gaza. It's responsible for 250,000 students. It takes care of 200 schools, 50 clinics. It has 15,000 employees. UNRWA in Gaza is very important, more than UNRWA in Lebanon or in Syria or in Jordan or in the West Bank, because 75% of the Gazan are refugees. And UNRWA mandate has extended due to the poverty. So Gaza, the whole entire Gaza become a refugee economically. If it's not refugee politically, they are refugee economically. So UNRWA has to take care of non-refugee as well. UNRWA is facing a huge financial deficit. They are not able, they might not be able to pay the full salary for the 15,000 families. And you know that each family of UNRWA, each one of UNRWA worker finance not his own family, but his relatives. And this 15,000 and other services, education and health and humanitarian assistance by UNRWA, this will impact negatively the standard of living in Gaza. A fourth element, which is the last one, is the international support to Gaza. It has been decreased by the corona, not only to the government, but also to the civil society. Me as a civil society person, we are suffering the shrinking of fund, because the donors, the traditional donor country in Europe and the Arab region, they stop or they decrease their support to the Palestinian, not only for the Palestinian, but due to their financial crisis. So all the players in Gaza are under severe funding problems, and the poverty, the socio-economic is increasing a lot. Last statement for everybody, there is a lot of crime, there is a lot of radicalization among Gaza youth. 65% of the Gaza youth are under 30 years old. Most of these people have never been outside. We are increasing by 5,000 people every month. We are so good in this aspect. We are increasing by 60,000 people. Can you imagine 37% of the Gaza population were born under the siege? Can you imagine 1/3 or more than 1/3 of a society have never been outside? And these people in 10 years' time, if the siege continue, they will be the leader of the future. So people who lived entirely in a siege, how can make peace or be tolerant or be peace lover with outsider? Siege is not good only for us. It's not good for the Israeli. It's not good for the American. It's not good for the region. And Gaza, despite the fact that it's small, it's the stabilizing factor, destabilizing factor in the region. So we are living in a small place, inhabited by 2 million people, that increasing by 60,000 persons every year, is not recognized by the international community, and they look at us as a humanitarian in need. Yes, we need to eat, we need to work, but we need to build, we need development. The developmental process in Gaza has been stopped since June 2007. Of course, the only way is the Palestinian reconciliation. But of course, the international community doesn't need to wait for this to happen. Now we are in need for health assistance urgently to help. Otherwise, it will be a catastrophe, a nightmare catastrophe will happen in Gaza. Hopefully, that will be very soon. Thank you very much. Hoping it was useful.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. Thank you. Yes, that was very useful, although very also bleak view. Of course, the blockade on Gaza was illegal under international law. It should be, before we talk about anything else, the blockade should be lifted, and that's the position of the United Nations, definitely the position of ESCWA, and it is one of the single main reason behind the de-development in Gaza and the suffering and the policy and the poverty, unemployment, and the destruction of the social and economic infrastructure in Gaza. We'll get back to that situation specifically. Now we'll move to Dr. Tahani Mustafa, who is the Economic and Social Research Council postdoctoral fellow at LSE. she is specialized and has many publications, especially about security governance and development in general, and security governance specifically. And she will be talking about this aspect of aid to Palestine, which is the aid that has been going into the security sector, development, as it has been one of the main, let's say, issues of contention, and it has had quite a share of the international aid that was pouring into Palestine. Tahani, are you still with us? It seems yes, we can hear you now. Did you hear everything? Yes? Did you hear everything, Tahani? Okay, Tahani, go ahead. Okay, maybe we've lost a connection with Tahani. So until we get Tahani back online, we can basically start. Hello?
From the floor, is the end question.
There's a question.
We have a question on Facebook for Dr. Ala. What do you think is a suitable substitute to the ineffective neoliberal economic policies that was brought with aid, especially under no Palestinian sovereignty? This question came on our Facebook page. And you have to answer in 2 minutes.
Yeah, maybe I take it while Tahani tries to join us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this question. I mean, that goes to the core of the issue, because the aid framework that was designed inherently within this neoliberal economic policies, within the framework of economic peace that was mainly dictated by the World Bank at the time until the present day, which says the Palestinians will reconcile, reach to the political agreement once they feel the economic benefits of the so-called peace, and once they have the economic incentive. The problem with all of that by now is that that framework is so entrenched, and it's not only imposed or dictated by the international actors, but it is also adopted by the Palestinian actors themselves. And here I'm referring to the Palestinian leadership, this leadership that lead the Palestinian development process. So the state building project of the Palestinian Authority, particularly since 2007 until now, firmly believed in this neoliberal notion and design of the state building project, but also of the aid delivery. So before moving to the alternative, let's say, or we need to engage in a process to reverse all these decades long of consequences that came up with this neoliberal package, which is very hard and difficult task to do in the first place. But it should be also accompanied with equally important step, which is to not only to reimagine and redesign or design a new and different aid framework within the overall economic strategy of the Palestinians, but that economic strategy needs to be very much linked to their political struggle, because economies and economics does not exist in vacuum. It has to be directly linked with the political project and with the political struggle within this colonial structures and all the systems of apartheid that we're seeing there. So it really starts first by reversing what we have on the ground. Second, by imagining a different economic plan and economic deal. And third, by really engaging in a processes of building the productive base for the Palestinian economy. And that goes at the moment with adopting development as a confrontational paradigm to confront the power dynamics that exist there. And that kind of resistance take us to the other level of engagement vis-a-vis the donors and vis-a-vis the economic plan through bringing the Palestinians to the on top of the development thinking in order to think about a different approach to development and fundamentally to change the power imbalances between the occupied and the occupier. So this is just a, let's say, glimpse of answer that my other fellow panelists could also add to this. But resisting what we have here is a first step in that direction.
Okay. Okay. It seems Tahani has lost connection completely. We hope she comes back. I'm going to, in this case, follow up on what you just said. When you talk about reversing what has happened and the policies and reimagining the economy and the institutions and the whole political framework, what would you think, since we're talking about international aid now, and we're talking about that this is all political, what would you think the role of this international aid would be in this process, if any?
Well, one of the tests that I envisage that will happen soon, the role of this aid within the current framework, will happen soon in 2021 when we have a new U.S. administration. As was mentioned earlier, it is very likely that the new U.S. administration will re-engage with the Palestinians through the Palestinian Authority and through the influx of the aid to the Palestinian Authority, and in particular to the security sector that I hope Tahani will join us in a second and highlight in her intervention. But that real test, I'm afraid, will bring the old normal back to life, will result in the same old negative consequences that we had there. Years ago, when Biden was in the administration under Obama, we witnessed the so-called John Kerry's billions and that Palestine Economic Initiative. Nothing was really materialized out of that. And because that was a plan that was inherently problematic and problematic by design, but also with a flawed economic rationale with many unattainable outcomes. What I'm afraid about now is that we're coming to replace Kerry's billions with Biden billions, or whoever will be the new Secretary of State. And that's what the different U.S. administrations since Carter time until the present day and the future will follow, because that's the only way that they are doing. So if we're talking about the role of aid, and here if we're taking the U.S. aid of the U.S. Aid, I'm afraid, of course, I agree with Mandy's take that we will not see changes in the coming future, especially because the Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership lost the opportunity when Trump administration decided not to engage with Palestinians through aid. They lost the opportunity to re-engage, to restructure the aid process and the aid framework. And instead, they just kept trying to beg for the money and try to find ways to re-engage with the old framework that did not deliver any meaningful output to the Palestinians, thinking here of what Omar just said and all these situations in Gaza. So that's a quick brief. But I see Tahani is here, so I just want to just move to her before we lose her again. And I think that's over to you, Tahani.
Thank you, Ala. Go ahead, please, Tahani.
Tahani, you're on mute, I think.
I had connection issues. I think that says something if Gaza gets better internet connection than I do here. So anyways, thank you for having me today. So essentially, I kind of just want to give you a very brief overview of the security sector and the security situation when it comes to the topic of aid and development. And unfortunately, you know, again, following on from what seems to be a theme today, it's not going to be a very kind of optimistic outlook, nor is it going to really end with one either. So just to kind of give you a quick overview, because I also am aware of what you have now in the occupied territories, or specifically within the West Bank, is a real disconnect between rhetoric that's coming out from the donor community and the reality that's unfolding on the ground. And to start with, what you have is, first of all, you're dealing with state building, and in particular security assistance under conditions of, or within the context of occupation, a lack of sovereignty. So never mind the context that you're actually dealing with, but the fact that within that you are also dealing with an intertwining of political and economic interests, that all come with the trappings of bureaucracy. So if you just want to start with just, you know, the issues of bureaucracy when it comes to security assistance in the occupied territories, that in itself has created quite a significant contradictory landscape within the occupied territories and within the West Bank specifically. So in that sense, what we would talk about is the fact that, you know, if you just look at organizations like UPOCOPS, the United States Security Coordinator, they have quite a significantly short turnaround of staff, and that creates a lack of real investment personnel that are involved within these organizations in terms of the projects that they're overseeing and in terms of the projects that they want to then pursue. And that in itself very much, you know, affects the kind of training and the logistical support that is being offered to the Palestinians. On top of that, you've got the issue of a lack of, you know, benchmarks, a lack of realistic timeframes, a lack of adequate assessments when it comes to logistical training and equipping. That is then coupled with the fact that you have, you know, a significantly, you've got quite a saturated security sector that has quite a number of stakeholders involved in the occupied territories, because you're talking about a triadic relationship between the international donor community, the Palestinians and the Israelis. That's quite a number of different stakeholders, each with their own different varying political and economic interests. And those will inevitably clash, and they have clashed, but yet they still somehow find synergy in the fact that ultimately, at the end of the day, each has an interest in retaining the status quo. So going back to the point that, you know, Mandy and Alat made, development in this context is highly, highly politicized. Yes, you can have all these kind of unintended consequences that come with bureaucratic trappings, but ultimately, at the end of the day, there is a highly politicized agenda that comes with this. And merely just looking at the fact that the concept of security, that security support and priorities and the vision of security is all determined from outside. It comes from the international donor community, not the Palestinians. When you want to talk about local ownership in the context of state building here, the Palestinians have very little. And those that do endorse the rhetoric of the donor community often do so because they have a vested interest in doing so. Not only do they receive, you know, the economic perks that come with that, but also international legitimacy. So there is, you know, a real case of having entrenched interest involved. And just as an illustration of this, one of the things had done, which was, you know, quite clever on their part, was to expand the network of security collaboration and cooperation within the ranks of the Palestinian security forces themselves. And so initially under Arafat, you had, you know, security cooperation with the Israelis taking place just at the top tier levels. You probably had like 3 or 4 senior officers involved. Now, today, you're talking about second and third ranking tier officers who are also involved in coordination activities. And they do this because that also then comes with certain perks. For example, you get, permits to go into, to go to Tel Aviv. You can get, it gives you a wider, access to, perks that obviously most Palestinians don't have access to. So what you ended up having created within that context is a warped governing authority, a completely disunified security sector, multiple allegiances, and there's no single structured hierarchy within the occupied territories. You can't talk about a centralized state. You can talk about protection rackets, you can talk about oligopolies of violence, but you cannot talk about a single centralized governing authority that monopolizes the means of violence, which is what the international community has claimed to be promoting for the last 20 years with its security assistance programs. It's claimed to, try to enforce the rules of good governance and the rule of law, and it's tried to, create a centralized state that has the means of enforcing law and order, and that's simply not the case.
Thank you very much, Tahani. Well, you can, I think there is a centralized power in the West Bank, which is Israel, basically, the occupying power. But absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's the problems arising from funding, the way that funding has been channeled into the security sector, and has created a whole bunch of problems and issues which are highly politicized again, linked to agendas, political agendas of the donors of Israel and internally within Palestine itself as well. I have my colleague Judith Qadri would like to has a question to pose to Mandy.
Yes.
Please.
Okay, my question to Mandy. You mentioned that one of the main reasons aid is harmful is that powerful donor countries have a positive foreign policy towards Israel. However, do you see any countries that are in power position that could shift this trend in the future, such as China?
Do you want me to come back on that now, Rabia? Okay. There's been a lot of discussion about the possibilities that a rising China and other BRIC countries, as they're called, might have on Middle East, the Middle East situation. And I don't see any evidence of this so far. I think that there's too much emphasis put on this. The Chinese have really, in many ways, actually been more interested in being involved in Israel. They've bought some of the ports in Israel, and they're more interested in kind of keeping under the radar. China's policy has always been about developing the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the new Silk Roads, and having a foothold in Europe and Asia through that mechanism. So I think the idea that China might involve itself in what has been an incredibly fractious situation, and one that America sees itself as the leading light on, is, I think, not feasible. I don't see that happening in the near to medium future. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Mandy. I have Omar. We talked about the conditions in Gaza and how the importance of UNRWA and other donors. We know that if it wasn't for the humanitarian aid being channeled into Gaza, the situation would have been worse, in terms of some even go and say we would have been seeing a famine breaking out in Gaza if it weren't for humanitarian aid. Now, here the question is twofold. Do you think it's true? Okay, of course, assuming the blockade is still in place. Is this, according to your, as far as you know, is this assessment, how realistic is that? And this follow-up question to that would be, if so, then when would be a good time basically to try and to shift the aid from the humanitarian to development, considering that the money, the amount of funds earmarked for Gaza is not going to be substantially different in both cases?
Rabbi, thank you for the question. Also, to make myself precise, UNICTAD estimated that the international support to Gaza, the damage that happened to Gaza by $17 billion in the past 14 years. This means $1.2 billion a year. The donation to Gaza was much less than that. So the damage much more than the recipient, the received money. Second, the money that came to Gaza, it was to rebuild what was built. So there was very little to the future. My evidence on that is the level of standard of life in Gaza has become much less. Usually, you receive international support to improve the life, to improve the services, to improve the quality of life. This was not the case at all in Gaza. Of course, the situation will be catastrophe without the international support, either from Europe, America, or from the Arab. But we need to look at the roots of the problem. The roots of the problem is the security situation, the blockade, and the lack of peace, lack of stability. And this answer the second question, which is the context for that is we need to reestablish the Palestinian Authority, a unity Palestinian government that be able to receive the international support and put it in a developmental plan. If the situation in Gaza continue for another 100 years, the situation will be much worse every year, because regardless how much money you send to Gaza for a humanitarian, still you need developmental project, developmental plan to meet with the future challenges. We are increasing, as I said, by 5,000 newborn every month, 60,000. So we are in need for 40,000 new jobs every year, at least. Some of these people will leave, immigrate, but at least 40,000 will be immigrated, will be adult every year. So there will be job applicant. The only way, unfortunately, that it didn't happen is the Palestinian reconciliation, because the international community did not recognize the authority in Gaza, and people found themselves in the middle. So we are punished by the politics. That's why I started my presentation by saying that everything in Gaza is very politicized. The international support to Gaza was stopped for political reason. The money that come from Qatar to Gaza for the past 20 months comes for security reason, to keep the truce, to keep the calm. And all this money didn't go to the development. It goes to electricity, to buy fuel from Israel to fuel the power plant in Gaza. Until now, we have 12 to 14 hours of electricity every day to build the infrastructure that was destroyed. So we need to think about building new things that fulfill the need of the new generation. What's going on the past 14 years proved that everything has failed, and we will continue in this situation until a political solution is found, and this political solution cannot be found only with the Palestinian reconciliation. So I use this opportunity to urge the Palestinian faction, Fatah, Hamas, BA, to come up together and to finish this process. Of course, there will be some objection to the national reconciliation by Israeli and by some of the international actors, but the Palestinian politics should be more assertive to achieve the reconciliation. Is good for everybody. It's good for our political project that is led by the PA, and it's good for our people, and it's good for the stability in the Middle East, and it's good for the security of Israel as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Omar, for this elaboration. We have another question online.
If you want to read it,
When?
an intervention.
What?
Intervention from Muhammad Samhouri.
Sure.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, it's not a question.
So we have an intervention from a friend of, I think, all of us, Muhammad Samhouri. Greeting friends, in my view, the main problem with donors aid to the OPT since 1994 is that it was not coupled with serious and persistent efforts by the donor community to end Israeli colonizing occupation. The unfortunate and largely expected outcome was that aid, which amounted to more than $40 billion, was utterly ineffective to build an independent, aid-free Palestinian economy. Unless donors get serious on the political front, aid will continue to be needed, but with no tangible results. And I guess this is the consensus that we've been having on this panel. Unfortunately, and personally, I have 2 pages full of questions still, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. And so I'm just going to take one more question from Simel Asim. Could you say a few words on the relevance of strengthening Palestinian community-based organizations that can play both economic and social functions, such as cooperatives or other social and solidarity economy organizations? And I'm guessing this question, let's start. Tahani got a question. I don't know if you have any insight to that, but I'm sure you do. So please go ahead.
You're mute, Tahani.
I always forget that one. I absolutely concur with that comment and assertion that it is important to start strengthening community-based organizations. And I think one of the things that we can probably, or one of the lessons that we can bring out in the current situation, or in light of the global health pandemic, is that the Palestinian Authority's successes and response has been essentially local community responses have been the backbone of that success. It's been precisely in areas that not only the PA hasn't really been able to physically reach, like areas B and C, but even within areas A, the PA has relied significantly on local community initiatives. And a lot of that has been derived from experiences that they've had before the PA was there, pre-1994. Palestinians have something that actually most societies don't, which is they are able to tap into those resources, those societal resources. And in most COVID-19 success cases where states have been able to successfully deal with it, they've realized that actually the backbone of those successes have actually come from community initiatives. So I would definitely agree. I think there should definitely be a lot more attention and funding and support paid to those community engagement initiatives.
Thank you very much. Anyone wants to add anything? Ala, I see you.
Well, I don't want this panel to end without any positive notes. I'm just trying to bring some positive thoughts to this based on based on this discussion and also the question, because we know very well that the status quo is so entrenched. So what we really need to do as the first priority is to shake that rigid status quo. And by doing that, there are many Palestinian organizations that are trying to do this, working on the ground and supporting them is really crucial. Supporting thinkers and new thinking is really important because all of that could contribute to what is envisaged as economy of resistance or resistance economy, which we have a number of publications at Al-Shabaka trying to deal with the issue, because what really the Palestinians now urgently need is to have a different imagination again, and radical thinking, not only about politics, but also about this aid framework and the economic framework that we function within. So what we need to, and there are no scarcity of these voices, no scarcity of these organizations, so that make really an impact, especially from the grassroots civil society level. So this is a call to look for these positive signs, although they are hard to find within this overall bleak environment, but they exist, and it's part of the exercise to look for them and support. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say in this regard.
Okay, thank you, Ala, thank you, Mandy, thank you, Omar, Tahani, and I want to just concur and end this on a positive note. I think you just said the new buzzword, new thinking, new thinkers, and I'm sure there are many gems to be found, gems already working on the ground. We just need to maybe support them from outside as UN, and basically Palestinians will be guiding us through this journey. As you said, it should be Palestinians who tell us what should we be doing and not any other way. At the end, I would like to thank you all for your time, for your thoughts, and for all the viewers and all the questions online, and to all the colleagues. And it's until we meet again very soon to work further on this, hopefully. Thank you all, and see you very soon. Thank you.